I'm Michelle Setlick with the Hall County Historical Society, and I'm thrilled today to talk to you about one of my favorite subjects, family history. I've been a family historian since I was 13, which is many, many years ago. And over that time, I have explored both sides of my family. I've explored my husband's family, and I've had both of my kids involved in family heritage projects. So today I want to talk to you a little bit about how to get started exploring our own family history, and then some different things that you could do to explore and record your family history. Maybe even some projects that you could do with children also. So getting started, I always talk about the do's and don'ts. I've created a list of do's and don'ts for genealogy. The first do is always start with yourself. You know the most about you than anyone. So that's where you always want to start. Start with yourself. And you're going to record things about yourself, including your name, your date of birth, your place of birth, places you've lived, the dates that you moved, the date and place of your marriage if you've been married, any occupations you've had, military history, information on your children, any other biographical data that is readily available to you. You're going to write everything down. Just start recording. Once you get done with yourself, you move on to your parents and you record all of the same information on your parents. And then you go to the next generation and you just keep going back and back until eventually you get to something that looks like this. This is a family chart that I've created on my own family, and it shows me right in the middle of the chart. If you look at the middle and then going out from the center are my parents, and then their parents, their grandparents, their great-grandparents. So it took me about 25 years to find some of those missing pieces of my own family history. Because of a family legend or myth that I had that took a while. My great-grandfather was orphaned and taken in by a family, and it took me a while to find his parents. So sometimes you find those family stumbling blocks or roadblocks that in history. I always encourage you, though, to never give up, keep going on, because eventually you'll find the right answer. The don't I tell people about family history is don't worry about the tools. You don't need a lot of really fancy tools to start exploring your own family history. You can simply start with pen and paper, maybe a 3-ring binder to keep all of your information together. Paper for the binder, you want to have lined and unlined papers as well. Audio recorders, phones are amazing tools that we have now. You can use a phone to record videos, record audio recording when you're doing interviews, maybe take pictures if you're going out to different places, pictures of documents, pictures of tombstones. This phone is really an amazing tool that we have in our handbag right now. And you might want to start with some forms, and there's free forms that you can get out there. You don't have to start out. You might think that you need to buy some fancy software or sign up to a subscription-based service. You really don't need to. There are a lot of really good free resources out there, and a lot of them are available here at the library as well. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those. So here at the library, if you come into the library, we have this amazing heritage room that we're in today. And in the heritage room, there are lots of resources. There are books, there is newspaper, and you also have access to computers in here that you can come in and access one of the most popular genealogy softwares, Ancestry.com. And you can access it for free with your library card. You do have to come to the library, though, to access the Ancestry software. But some other things that you can access through the library's website that you don't have to physically come into the library for are the Hall County newspapers. The Grand Island Public Library partnered with the Hall County Historical Society and other organizations in Hall County to get the Hall County newspapers. There were actually 28 of them digitized and available to you online, so you can search based on keywords. If you're searching for the newspapers, all you have to do is log onto the website, and it's available right on the Historical Society's webpage, and it's also available on the library's webpage. You can go right in there, type a keyword. So for example, if I was to be searching for something in my family, I can go in, type a name, and every time that my family's name appeared in the newspaper, I could click on that and I could see. So if I'm looking for an obituary or any kind of an article, that's all available to me for free. You can also access a really great database online called myheritage.com, and that's available with your library card through an online database through Nebraska Access. So if you go to the Grand Island Public Library site and go to Digital Library and Online Resources or Databases, you can see that you can access through the Nebraska Access, the myheritage.com. And you do need to have a library card to do that. So if you don't have a library card, make sure you get that. But that's all free. You can also access MyAccess with your Nebraska driver's license. There's another great resource, and you do have to have a library card for this one. It's called newsbank.com. It's all of the Nebraska, or not all of the Nebraska newspapers, but there are a lot of Nebraska newspapers and the most recent newspapers. So the newspaper project that you can access includes all 28 of the Hall County newspapers. However, the Grand Island Independent, we only have digitized up to 1924. Their parent company has made an agreement with another subscription service to digitize their papers after 1924. And Newsbank actually has a lot of the more recent Grand Island newspapers. So there might be a gap right now until the rest of those independents are digitized. But for that, you can come in here. They have, the library has a microfilm reader and all of the microfilmed Grand Island independents as well. So if you're looking for an obituary or a birth notice or a marriage notice, you can certainly come to the library and access the microfilm. And if you stop at the reference desk, they would certainly help you learn how to use those microfilm readers if you don't have any experience with that. There's one more database that you can access through the library, and that's called worldcat.org. It's actually a digital library. You can access books or articles with your library card again, but that's a completely free resource that you can use from home. There are lots of other online resources that you can use. So right now, if we're not leaving home, don't worry. You can still do a lot of your family research from where you are. And these resources are available. The list is here on this site, and there will be some information available to you as well. Some of these sites are fee-based or subscription services. Some of them are free, but there certainly is a wealth of information out there that you do not have to pay any additional fees for. History Nebraska is also launching a large digitization project where they're going to digitize a lot of birth records and death records. So those will probably in the near future be coming available. So be watching for that as too. As more and more records and resources become digitized, it makes us easier to do this research from our homes. Do get your family involved. This is a big one because there's a lot of people in your family that have already either started research or know things that you don't know that would be really great. So some of the old family documents that your families might have are photographs. And photographs, of course, are amazing in telling the history of the family, but sometimes photographs hold clues as well. I was researching in my husband's family and found a photograph of 3 young children. It was on the back of it, it was listed Anna, age 8, Henry, age 6, and Michael, age 4. Well, I knew who Henry and Michael were. Henry was my husband's grandfather, and Michael was his youngest brother. But Anna was a mystery. And Henry, we'd always thought was the oldest child in the family. The more research I did, I found that Anna was actually the oldest child, and she had died shortly after that picture was taken. She had been buried in a small country cemetery, and the family then proceeded to have several other kids. Life was very busy. Michael and Henry both very young when their sister died, and no one really spoke a lot about Anna after that. So she kind of been lost to family until we found that photograph and were able to connect her back to the family. Newspaper articles are really great resources. I told you that there's an online database here of the Hall County newspapers. There are other county newspapers available online for too. You can access, if you type Hall County newspapers Advantage Archives, There's a list of all of the counties that have already been digitizing their newspapers. That's a great resource. There's other subscription-based services like newspapers.com that are fee-based services you can also access as well. But a lot of communities have been digitizing their newspapers. But there are other newsworthy events that you find in those newspapers, not just marriages and births and deaths. It can be someone went to a party at someone else's house. When I was starting the research in my husband's family, we had, I went to his sister's house. My husband was the youngest one of the family. His mother had died by this point, and I went to his sister's house, and she had the trunks that had belonged to her grandmother. And there were all of these scrapbooks full of newspaper articles. I asked about it. My husband's brother said, well, Grandma just, every time a neighbor was in the newspaper, she would cut it out and paste it in this scrapbook. The more research I did on the family, I realized that these weren't just random neighbors. These were family members, and they didn't realize that they were family members. So Grandma actually gave us a really great gift in preserving those newspaper articles with all of these different people because we were able to connect them back to the family tree. Yearbooks are great resources. Letters. I had an amazing stack of letters that my grandfather had written to my grandmother during World War II. We came across them, and it was a really, really great peek into that family history. Diaries and scrapbooks. My daughter had taken a notebook that my husband's grandmother had written back in the early 1900s. She called it her Every Sunday Journal, and she wrote down all the things that she was doing in her life at that time. So as a 4-H project, my daughter actually took that notebook and she transcribed all of her grandmother's entries in that notebook into a word processing document, and then printed it all out and put it together in a really nice scrapbook with pictures of her grandmother. What she found out when she was doing this, her grandmother had been born in the early 1900s. Her great-grandmother was born in the early 1900s, but she found out there were a lot of similarities between them. They liked going to games. They liked going to dances. They liked hanging out with their friends. So scrapbooks and diaries hold incredible keys to your family history. If you're fortunate enough to have a family Bible or have someone that has access to a family Bible, that's also a great resource. Marriage certificates give us a lot of information. Not only do they give us information about the bride and groom, but it'll usually tell us who their parents were as well and where they were born. Death and birth certificates, the same thing. They will tell us the person's name, where they were born or where they died, the date, and then who their parents were. It'll also usually tell us who the recorder is. And in the case of death certificates, it's usually a child or a grandchild. So that gives us one more link in the family tree. And then, of course, if you have a family tree that's already started by someone else, it's a great place to start. When I started working on my dad's family, the Nielsen family, I found that my great aunts had started. So I took what they had done and I did my own research, made sure I had all the documentation for all of the information. And I just built upon that and built until I finally was able to publish a book on my dad's family that goes all the way back to the Revolutionary War. So family trees that someone else started are a really great place to start. Visiting with family members is another great way to gather information about yourself. My grandfather, before he passed away, it was great to be able to sit down with him and record stories that he had. We also would sit down with his siblings and talk about family stories and record it. I call myself a family historian, not just a genealogist, because I believe in capturing the story as well. So all of those interesting things, like the time that my dad and his sister ran away from home, but his sister had a little red balloon that she was carrying through the fields. So that's how they got caught. Those are the interesting stories. That's the character of a family. And I think besides just the dates and the names and the places, you need to be recording those family stories. Try to have a list of specific questions if you're interviewing someone, especially an older family member. And don't drag out those interviews too long. I found that the shorter you can keep it, maybe an hour or less, and then if you have more frequent ones, so maybe you come back in a week or a couple weeks, they might have an idea or something that sparked based on what you said. So keep the interviews brief. They might have some different memories to share with you the next time you come back. And of course, try to do a video or audio recording if you can when you're doing interviews. Sometimes people are very intimidated about that. But again, going back to the cell phone, since we all have cell phones that we carry around all the time, what I have found is if I sent my cell phone just in the middle of the table, hit record, and then just start talking, all of a sudden people forget that the cell phone is there because we're so used to seeing them. So they're more apt to open up and be more comfortable when you're recording. Family Facebook is a great way to connect family members. Not only is it a good way to get information, it's a good way to share information with your family. I have several family Facebook groups for different parts of my family, and we share things that we find. We encourage others to share information with us. I've gotten some really incredible things through my family Facebook. My great-grandfather's sister had worked for Rose Kennedy. I put something on the family Facebook page asking about it, and a family member who actually had the reference letter that Rose Kennedy had written for my aunt said, "Oh, I have that letter here. Let me share it with you." So it's really a great way to get information, but it's also a really great way to share the information that you're discovering with your family. Visit cemeteries. Cemeteries are really great resources. People are usually buried close to where they lived. Not always, but most of the time. If you go to a cemetery, take another family member with you. They can help you locate those family markers, and they might have some stories or memories to share with you while they're there. Make sure you record everything that's written on the marker. Taking a picture sometimes is a really good idea. If you have an older stone, you might have a hard time seeing what's on the stone, so you can take a rubbing of that stone. Or you can use water or a mirror to make the image a little bit easier to see. Gravestones will tell you a lot about a person. They'll tell you, of course, their name, their age, their birth and death dates. Sometimes it'll tell you their occupation or their military service. It'll tell you other family members, what their hobbies, interests, clubs, and organizations were. Sometimes those are through symbols. Sometimes there's actually information printed on the stone. So for example, on my grandparents' stone, it has not just their names and their death and birth dates and their marriage date. It also lists the names of their children and the names of all of their grandchildren. So cemeteries and gravestones can give us really great avenues to go down to find that family history. Don't take all family stories as fact. I can't say this one enough. We all have those really amazing stories in our families, really cool, tall tales that have been told through the generations. Sometimes they are just really cool stories. Sometimes they are actually based in fact. But until you have the documentation, try not to take all family stories as fact. So for example, my great-grandfather, the one that I said took me 25 years to find his information, when I first started on my genealogy search, I was actually 13. This was before the internet. And I did a road trip with my parents. They took me on a road trip to Iowa to go find information on my grandfather's family. Now, the story I'd been told was my grandfather, his father had died in an accident, and his mother died a year later, and he and his siblings were on the orphan train. Well, I found out he was born in Iowa. The orphan train, if you aren't familiar with it, actually started in the bigger cities on the East Coast, like New York, where kids were literally put on trains and sent out west to families to take out of the orphanages that were overcrowded in the bigger cities. So if he was born in Iowa, chances were he wasn't on the orphan train. What I did discover was he actually was in an orphanage in Iowa, and that's where the family from Nebraska went and adopted him from. So again, it took me 25 years to find out the truth. But what I actually found when I finally dug down and got the information was that my grandfather's father had actually left the family. And his mother was very sick, and she took the children to the orphanage and left them there because she wasn't going to be able to take care of them herself. So again, that was a family story, family myth that wasn't actually true. But there are other ones that are true, like the one of my aunt working for the Kennedy family. I did find the documentation to prove that one. Do document, document, document. This one I cannot stress enough. And this will help you in the long run as you continue to look for information on your family. When you're documenting, you always want to record the information about where you found things. So for an obituary, if you're using an obituary, it was usually printed close to where that person lived. It can contain lots of information about that person, including their name, birth date, place of birth, their parents' names. It can include their spouse's information, their marriage dates, names of their siblings, their children, their grandchildren, the date and place of their death and burial. Other valuable information that can be found in obituaries include jobs they've had, places they've lived, their education, and so forth. Census records are another really great resource that we can use as a document. The first U.S. Census was actually taken in 1790. Although that first census, the Founding Fathers didn't trust that it was completely accurate, people were a little leery about giving their information to census takers even back in 1790. They had been under British rule for so long, and they were a little bit leery about government officials coming to their door asking for information. So the first census was not completely accurate. It's gotten better over the years. But every 10 years, there is a census taken in the United States. We have census workers who would visit the houses in every county to record information about the people that lived there. Today, we get our census in the mail or we go online, but it really was a door-to-door operation back in the early days. Now, one of the things, if you're getting into genealogy, and anyone who's been doing genealogy for a while will know, is there's a missing gap. 1890. The 1890 census was actually destroyed by fire. And that's been a really hard hurdle for a lot of genealogists to overcome. So going back to my great-grandfather, that was really one of the reasons I had a really hard time in finding out the information about his family. He was born in 1888, and by 1900, by the time the 1900 census came around, he was actually living in the orphanage in Des Moines. Or Council Bluffs. It was Council Bluffs. But anyway, I never had a census record with him living with his family because that 1890 census was destroyed by fire, which made it really hard for me to find the information about him. There are other things that you can use other than if you have something like that, you have someone who was born in the late 1880s and you're trying to find information about them and you've got that gap until 1900. A lot of times, census records were also recorded by states on every 5 years. So, for example, my grandfather, I found an 1895 census in Iowa. Unfortunately, by 1895, he was living in the orphanage at that time as well. So it didn't do me a lot of good for that one. But there are usually census records in those early years, about every 5 years in between the federal census, that you can use as well. So other records you can use when you're doing your family search, like I said, birth and death and marriage records, usually those are held at the county offices or the state office. So in Nebraska, if I wanted to get a marriage certificate in Hall County, I would go down to the Hall County Courthouse. In the clerk's office there, they could help me with that. If I wanted to get a death or birth certificate in Nebraska, I'd actually have to fill out a form and send it to the Nebraska Department of Health and Human Services, and I would get that form from them. Now, having said that, it's a little bit more of a challenge to get birth and death records. Those are vital records and they are protected. So if it's for genealogy purposes, you have to explain what you're doing, how you're related, and in some states, you actually have to give quite a bit of information to show that you are legally allowed to have that information. I joke in Oklahoma, I was trying to get my great-great-grandmother's death certificate, and I had to send copies of my birth certificate, my father's birth certificate, my grandmother's birth certificate, her death certificate. I joke that I had to stop just short of promising them my firstborn child and a vial of blood. but they do really take security and privacy very seriously. So just understand that they're not trying to make it difficult for you, but they're trying to protect information. Especially, it's going to be very hard, if not impossible, to get information about someone who is still living. Cemetery records are really great. They will have burial records usually at the cemetery. If you went, say, over here at the Grand Island Cemetery, if you were looking for something, they actually do keep records on all the individuals buried there. So you could go to the cemetery office and ask about that. You could also find church records. If you go to a church, you could find baptism, marriage, and funeral information in churches as well, too, if you know what church the person was baptized or married or had their funeral in. The state and local historical societies, sometimes at a local library, you can find family histories, census records, voter registrations, and lots more information. So here at the Grand Island Public Library, like I said, we have a lot of great resources that you can come in here and find. Behind me on the shelves, we have first the Betsy Hager DAR library. This is one of two DAR libraries, which is Daughters of American Revolution in Nebraska, and it's located right here in the Grand Island Public Library. Behind me after that would be the Prairie Pioneer Genealogical Society's library. And then, of course, the Grand Island Public Library has their own records and books that you can access as well. This first row right here, when you come in the cemetery, or when you come into the library, are actually other states, and they are grouped by state, and they have colorful dots to show you what states they are. About 3 rows behind me, you'll find the Nebraska records. And when you get to the Nebraska records, they actually are grouped by county. So if you wanted to come in and find Nebraska records for Hall County or Custer County or Cherry County or whatever county you wanted, you could come in and see if they have them here at the library. So you want to check that out. You can also, here at the library in the microfilm, there are other records as well too. There are some older census records that you can find in the microfilm, but a lot of the census records are available for free online as well. You can also access immigration records. If you have an ancestor who came through, say, Ellis Island, if they were on a ship, there's usually ship manifests that you can find. Military records. There are a lot of great resources. Fold 3 is a paid service that you can access. It's through Ancestry, but there's also, when you come into the library and use your library card to access Ancestry.com, there are a lot of great military records that you can find that way. Court records, including wills and probates. One of the most interesting court records I ever found when I was doing my family research was a case in which my 3 times great uncle was sued by his nephew for slander. And the most interesting thing about this case was the nephew sued the uncle for slandering his name because the nephew had actually made a claim about another uncle and his wife that they hadn't been married. They were living in sin. And this was in the 1840s in Illinois. And why that it was such an interesting case was he sued his uncle for $1,000 for slander. And the uncle had a really great lawyer who negotiated the case down. He lost the case. The uncle actually did slander him, but he negotiated the settlement down to $1. And that lawyer's name that negotiated that settlement down was Abraham Lincoln. And that record is still on file. It's the Linder versus Flinner. And it was really a great court record that I could use to really fill out my family history. Adoption records are really, really hard to access. Again, that privacy and security. But if you can access an adoption record, that can give you a lot of really good information about that person and their family. There's also school records. If you had someone who went to school here in Grand Island at senior high, you could come in and you could access. They have in the microfilm old Grand Island Senior High newsletters. There's also yearbooks that you can access and lots of things too. And the list just goes on and on and on. Anytime any of our names are recorded anywhere is a record you can access and use as documentation in your family tree. So when you're recording the information, you always need to make sure that you record how you receive the information. So for example, if I was accessing it through either the digital newspapers Or here at the library on the microfilm readers, if I accessed a death notice from the Independent, I would record it as the Grand Island Independent death notice and the date that it was in the newspaper. So for this example, March 26, 1998 is what you see on your screen. If you're recording information on married women, you always want to use their maiden names, their last name before they were married. So for myself, I would be recorded on my family tree as Nielsen, which is my maiden name, not Setlick. When you're recording information, record all the information about the place, not just the name of a town. So for example, I was born in Grand Island, Hall County, Nebraska. I wasn't born in just Grand Island. My great-grandfather was born in Conackacary County, Antrim, Ireland, not just Ireland. Try to be very specific when recording information. Don't believe everything you see on the internet. I know that sounds strange, but it's true. There is a lot of things that are recorded on the internet, and just because it's recorded there doesn't mean it's accurate. You should always consider, is this likely? Anyone can publish information. It doesn't mean it's correct. So for example, when I was working on my dad's family history, I had someone contact me and said, well, you missed this person's second marriage and the other 6 children he had. I said, no, I didn't. I know I've seen that online, but here is the date that he married his first wife, and here's the record I have to prove it. Here are the census records and the land records that showed how the family moved around. Here is her death certificate, and here's all of their children that are listed, and then here's when he died. So there really isn't a possibility that he was married and had a second family, because it just doesn't fit into the records. I had another person who I contacted. I'd seen something online, and it was something in my husband's family, and I contacted her and I said, you have these 2 individuals listed as being married, but it's actually an uncle and his nephew's wife that you have listed as husband and wife. And her response was, well, they were buried in the same cemetery. That doesn't mean that they were married. It just means they were buried in the same cemetery. So make sure you find the documentation to find out if it's really true or not. Now, I had one that I questioned. It showed a man who married a woman. He was in his 60s and she was 18, and they had a child, and then he died 2 years later. I really questioned it, and I talked to an uncle about it. He goes, oh no, that's really real. And here's this book that was written about the prominent men of this county in Illinois. And it listed there that, yes, that was him, and he had a bride that came over from the old country, and he married her when he was an old man and she was a young woman, and passed away a few years later. So make sure you find the documentation. Don't just believe everything you see. Those little leaves that you see on television commercials, they are suggestions of places to look. They're not actual fact until you have the documentation to back it up. Always, 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 and I cannot stress this one enough, be very careful in sharing information on the internet. Never, ever share names, given names, birth dates, marriage information of someone who's still living. If you're using a company like Ancestry and building your family tree, it won't show the name of a person that's still living. But if you're sharing it through, say you build a website, or you're using social media that's not your family, that it's not secured, always use the word living and the last name. So if I was to be talking about someone in my mom's family, I would say Living O'Neill. I wouldn't say their first name. I wouldn't give their information about their birth and death certificate. We want to protect our family records. So again, information gathered on the internet is always a suggestion of where to look. Don't take it as gospel until you have documentation to back it up. And do try alternate spellings. Sound out how names might have been spelled. Sometimes record keepers, including census workers or working in a newspaper immigration office, they spelled it like the recorder thought it sounded, not like the person themselves actually spelled it. So in my mom's family, her maiden name is O'Neill, Oneil. I've found the family name in different places with Oneal. I've also found something really interesting in my dad's family. My great-grandfather came from Denmark. And his name was Jens Nielsen, Nielsen. His brother, his full brother, Axel, came through a few years later, and they both settled in Howard County. They both lived side by side on farms in Howard County. But when Axel came through, the immigration authorities at that time spelled his last name Nelson, Nelson. And Uncle Axel thought it was too much work to change. So I had Jens Nielsen and Axel Nelson, who were full brothers living side by side in Howard County, that had different names. So try to spell out a name, because sometimes, like I said, they spell it the way they think it sounds, not the way it actually is. And do not give up when you hit a brick wall. Like I said, my first brick wall, when I started when I was 13, took me over 25 years before I finally found the record from the orphanage that said my great-great-grandmother took her children there. Once I found, and the interesting thing about that was one of the reasons it took me so long. So my grandfather, he listed on his marriage certificate, like I said, marriage certificates are a great way to find information. He listed on his marriage certificate that his father's name was Joseph Prentice and his mother's name was Mary Lee. So I knew I couldn't find in the 1890 census in Iowa, because there was no 1890 census. I tried going back to the 1880 census. I tried finding different things. I tried any way I could to find Joseph Prentice and Mary Lee. I could never find them. What I found when I finally was able to access a record from the orphanage, it was actually a letter that had been written over 75 years ago, when someone else was looking for information. Apparently, the director of the orphanage had written a letter that said Lucy Prentice had left her children, and it listed the names of the children. All of a sudden, I realized that her name was not Mary. Her name was Lucy. And once I found that out, I found out the father's name as well was Lawton. It wasn't Joseph. He had been left at a Christian-run orphanage. And again, his father hadn't passed away as the story had gone. His father actually lived beyond when my grandfather was a grandfather himself. So he didn't want people to know who his father was, and then he abandoned the family. He conveniently changed the names of his parents to Joseph and Mary instead of their actual names. Once I found the actual names, the records just flowed. I found all kinds of information. And one of the final do's I always tell people is, do find the stories. Like I said, I'm a family historian. I believe that the most people on their tree do not necessarily win. It's the people with the stories. You know, what motivated them? Why would they leave the country that they were born in? Why would they travel across the sea or across a border? What made them come here? What made them do the things that they did? What were their dreams? What were their hopes? How might have you felt in their shoes? I think back to my great-grandfather. There's some really great stories I found about him when he was an immigrant coming from Denmark. And he came all by himself, and he went to Kansas, where his mother's brother lived. And his uncle actually said, okay, now you go away. You have to go live in the English community for a while because everyone in that community spoke Danish. He said, you have to go live somewhere else. You have to learn the language. Once you do that, you can come back. So again, he was sent out in the world all by himself. What was he feeling? What were his motivations? What was the world like around them? When I was doing my husband's family history, I found that many of his ancestors who were still living in Poland during the World War had been asking for birth certificates. I found that was interesting, that there was this big run on birth certificates in the church. What I found out was they were trying to prove that they were not Jewish, they were Catholic. So they had to prove that to show to the Nazis what their religion was. Also, recording my own family history, my great-great-grandfather, who still lived in Denmark, even though 5 of his children came to the United States, he died under Nazi occupation of Denmark. So I wrote that in the story about his family. So think about the world around them at the time. Do a little research on that and kind of put that into context of your family. And what is the story behind family heirlooms that are left behind? Now, one of the things I always tell people when I do presentations are, you can do so much more with your family history than just recording the names, dates, and places of birth. My children, as I said, have both done genealogy projects, but they've been different genealogy projects. Talking about heirlooms, my daughter did this great project for 4-H where she went around the house and took photographs of different family heirlooms that we had, and then wrote on little index cards what each item was, where it came from, who originally owned it, and why it was important, and what that connection was. So that's another really great thing that you can be doing, especially right now. If you're sitting at home, be thinking about those family heirlooms that you have around the house and start to record information about those. One of the things you can also be doing, my dad is doing this right now, but some of my great aunts have done it in the past, is write your own history. Again, you know more about you than anyone. And you, even though you think that you don't have a really amazing story, you do. This is a book that one of my great aunts had written. It's her life story. Memories growing up, the schools she went to, stories with her siblings and her parents. It's really a fascinating read. Record your own life story. You don't need a lot to do it. Just a notebook. Start with a notebook. Maybe you'll find someone who can type it up for you, or if you have the capability of doing that yourself, that's a really great treasure that you can leave for your family. I've been doing genealogy for many, many years. I have a printed book. I also have a spiral bound book that I've put together on different parts of my family. Some of us, though, don't forget to record the history that's happening now. We live so much of our lives through social media. And don't forget to record that history. There's a really great resource I found through Facebook. We do a lot of recording of our lives through Facebook. What happens to those posts? How are we going to archive them? There's actually a company called My Social Book that will take your social media posts and they will print them all together for you in a yearbook fashion. So that's really a great way that you can record your family history that's happening right now for future generations. There's also things like Shutterfly books or other photo books that you can do family yearbooks. That's a great thing right now when we're sitting at home. My daughter, one of the things that she did was she did a family food tradition. And she actually just contacted different family members, asked them for recipes, family recipes, and then she recorded them all in the notebook. And she asked other questions like, who first made this? What is this made for? What's special? What memories do you have about this recipe? And she put it all together in this family notebook. So again, that's something really easy and simple that you can do to start recording your own family history. So it is endless, the things that you can be doing. And I hope that right now, with everything that's going on in the world, you can take a little time and maybe while it's a little slower in our lives, spend a little time recording your own family history, or coming over here to the library and start to work on your genealogy. Either way, good luck and best wishes. And I can't wait to hear some stories that people find maybe in the newspapers.